I'm Robert Hall. I'm the Director of Strategy for an organisation called Resilience First. And the organisation tries to advance the concept of resilience, particularly in business and in business communities, a collection of businesses. We've been around for 3 years, and we hope we've made some significant advance in helping people understand what it is and how to apply it.
Thank you. That sounds like a great place to start. The kind of first principles, what it is. What's your understanding of resilience in the context of companies and communities?
Well, this is a fascinating subject which we could spend a lot of time over, and I'm conscious of time. But it's very important to get an understanding, trying to get an understanding, common understanding of resilience, because that gives you a basis for moving forward. It's an increasingly popularly used word now. You see it everywhere. In fact, if you type it into Google, you'll get something like 3.5 billion entries for it. It's a bit like the word strategy or infrastructure. You can put various interpretations on those words and still have relevance. But a word that, or a sentence that I think summarizes it very nicely, and I'll explain more, is the phrase survive and thrive. Because it shows there are parts to resilience which are not only the element of recovery, surviving something, but also being able to thrive from it, to realize the opportunities. So I'm very keen that resilience in its concept is not related to bouncing back, which we often hear about, but more about bouncing forward, to realize a new state of play, which hopefully has opportunities in it. But in major events, you rarely return to where you were before. Something's changed, people have changed, situations changed. So bouncing forward is quite a good way of looking at it. And the other point I would make is there is no one solution to resilience. It isn't something that you can put down on paper and say, I've achieved. It's more a journey than a destination. It's a way of trying to order your mind and order your organization to make it more agile and flexible, and to look at threats and risks and changes in a more dynamic way. So on the basis of that, I would like to introduce a sort of diagram which I think tries to put a little bit more flesh on these bones. This diagram very simply tries to put some flesh on the bones that I've outlined, because there are 3 constituent parts to resilience if you accept what I've said so far. And those 3 parts are as shown here: anticipate, absorb, and adapt. And it is in a cycle, a virtuous cycle. So let me just explain that the anticipation part is really about preparation. And I'll come back to that because it is so important. And we seem to get in so many fixes because we don't prepare, anticipate in a full way. So it includes also some early warnings and horizon scanning and other ways of trying to look into the future, not predict, but to look ahead. The second stage is really to absorb, and that means really to recover, respond and recover to something that's happened. Whether it's minor or major, we all sort of recover from something. We pick ourselves up, we get off the floor, and dust ourselves down. So it's a sort of absorption process, which is typically connected with business continuity in business, that sort of idea. And the third one, which I think is the most important but often missed out, is really about how do you adapt and change and evolve as a result of going through the trauma, the event, the disruption that you've just experienced. And we all change from various ways. And it may not be instantaneous, it may be long-term. Even the change may be long-term. Climate change, for example, it doesn't have to be sudden. But we all change from it. And we hear much about adaptation to climate change. And hopefully through that process of learning, you then go back and are better able to be prepared for what comes next. And that leads me to my sort of final point about resilience, is that it should be a process for learning how to deal with disasters and change in general, not about something specific. It's about the generic way of dealing with a crisis. And that crisis may come up through pandemics, through a terrorism incident, through flooding. And you can be resilient in those respects. But generally, if you're going to be resilient, you have to try and have a philosophy that gets you through all those types, because one thing is sure, that the next crisis you faced will be not the one you anticipated.
Right. So on the one hand, it's that sense that you can survive the unexpected.
Yes,
But I guess also, and I think you're already hinting at this, is this sense that, you know, and this is an analogy that might strike home just at the moment, that you're swimming upstream and the flood of water is getting faster and harder, but it's that ability to continue to progress upstream and not suddenly be swept backwards. So it's not necessarily that short, sharp shock. It could be the sort of just the whole weight of the world.
absolutely. No,
Yeah,
absolutely right. It is, you can add lots of adjectives to this: determination, stoicism, robustness, fortitude, enthusiasm. All of these apply to resilience. So that is why it's such a complicated phrase or word in a sense. But you're absolutely right. It's sticking with hopefully some sort of plan and striving through whatever comes your way. But it's also, the point I'm making is that you may not know what is coming down that flood. It may be a log or a container, and you have to deal with it. There's no way you can plan everything. And
yes.
as Dwight Eisenhower said, plans are nothing, but planning is everything.
Yes, yes. I mean, the last sort of 2.5 years, or just over 2 years, with the pandemic has changed so many things
Indeed.
and caused us to rethink the way we see the world and the way we approach business. How has that affected the concept of resilience?
Well, I think it's brought it to the fore. It's certainly been a wake-up call to a lot of people, and perhaps that's why resilience is a word that you're seeing more and more often these days. I think it's awakened people's senses to the uncertainty of life, if we didn't already know that. Um, and, the willingness or the readiness to be sort of prepared for whatever comes. It's an interesting analogy with children. Parents don't sit down with their children and talk about, necessarily, unless it's pertinent at the time, bereavement or divorce or unemployment. What you try and do is awaken those senses of systemic risk, if you like, in life, and try and get people to be conscious of that. And I think the pandemic has really done that. It's also shown us quite effectively the need to prepare. I mean, the fact that we didn't have sufficient PPE, we prepared for influenza pandemic and not for coronavirus pandemic. We really didn't have an early warning system, uh, short of relying on the Chinese. All these things, I think the pandemic has shown us that we need to be better prepared. And I think the government has recognised that through having a integrated review. And hopefully from that will flow a national resilience strategy, which we're waiting with bated breath to see what it says.
Interesting. I mean, it's. I find it intriguing that this is not simply an intellectual exercise, and because if it were, then as you say, that the kind of drills that we would have been through would have meant we would have been alert to the risk and we would have taken action. But there's a strong kind of emotional
Yes.
element to this process, I guess.
Yes, and I think that's another important point you make about pandemic. It's because the pandemic has not affected buildings or infrastructure, they're all sound, but what it has affected is people. And actually, resilience is about people. Some might say that London is a very resilient city, and it's not because of its modern infrastructure. which is often goes back to the Victorian days. It's about the people who are resilient. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but you're dead right that resilience needs to focus on how people recover. And if people can't recover, then you won't be resilient, no matter
Yes.
how modern your infrastructure. Um, and that's an interesting connection to there is technology. That technology people think will make us resilient. And in general, I think that's a true concept. We've been resilient through the pandemic by virtue of Zoom. But that's relied on the internet. And if we hadn't got the internet, we would have really crashed. But again, technology has a downside because we tend to be so reliant on it. We're reliant on this virtual conversation we're having. If it didn't happen, we wouldn't be resilient in able to conduct ourselves. So, you know, technology has both a great advantage, but also a downside.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess you talked about people and individuals, and I guess there's a connection, a correlation between organizational resilience and human stress, I guess, and our resilience in the face of stress. You know, we are, if we have coping mechanisms, if we're not already under stress because we're not necessarily, you know, maybe we're not in debt and maybe we're in work, and then our ability to cope with
Yes.
is that much stronger. And I guess it's the same with organizations. You know, if your organization is not burdened with debt, already struggling with outmoded systems, then, you know, again, your ability
Yeah.
to deal with
No, absolutely right. And to take your earlier analogy of trying to swim up, you know, fast flowing river, you know, if you can't swim or you're a poor swimmer, you know, your resilience is not going
start.
to be
Yeah,
that great.
no, indeed.
Doesn't mean to say, you know, have to be superhuman in all respects. But it's interesting often that people who are resilient often have quite difficult backgrounds, but they have learned how to bounce back from these deficits and become more resilient generally. And you know, there's some fascinating stories in business about people who've come from nowhere, have had broken homes, but made a great success of their business and themselves. So it's both a sort of environmental and a genetic element to this, I think.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's interesting that learning is such an important part of that, because
Absolutely.
it comes to my next question, which is really how can you begin to measure and kind of assess your resilience or your organization's
Yeah.
resilience? I mean, what kind of process works, and what sort of information would you use to do that?
Yes. Well, it's an extremely good question because all that we said shows the complexity of this topic. Um, and therefore, the question is, can you measure it? And we at Resilience First have been doing our best to try and give people some form of assessment, albeit initially self-assessment. So that's a bit like marking your own homework, but a sort of toolbox to say, look, these are the important things we think are relevant to resilience in an organization. Um, and have a look at them, see what you think. How do you measure up to them and to score them, and then use that as a sort of benchmark, not an absolute GCSE type level of a score, but some sort of indication. And if you could put up the second slide, I'll just explain that in a little bit more depth. This diagram really sets out the 5 areas we think you can focus on to get a measurement, very raw measurement of what resilience means. And those 5 are people, place, process, performance, and preparation. And as the numbers below say, these help you to identify your strengths and areas for improvement and track how you might change over time. Just to give you a little bit of information on each of these, we've based them around 20 questions in each section. And they're statements rather than questions, where you have a slide and you then go from 0 to 5 and you assess yourself on those 20 odd questions, and it accumulates out of 100. And then you end up with some sort of pentagram, as I've shown in the bottom of the slide, which gives you a score for each of those 5 categories. And you may be strong on process, but not so strong with people. And hopefully, if you came back to do the same exercise in 6 months, if you worked at this, you could improve your score and thereby help your self-assessment of where you are going on this resilience journey. Now, it's not meant to be, an absolute watertight, definitive solution. But the statements we've come up with under each of these categories does, I think, enlighten what you would expect about resilience. So in people, we talk about community, we talk about empowerment, we talk about courage. It's those sorts of issues that an organization might be quite interested in, to see whether their people can meet up to those challenges. So that's the concept. And we hope that it's going to be adopted widely. It's free through our website and is a relatively simple and straightforward way of giving you an indication of what resilience is about.
Very interesting. I mean, it does. I guess the downside is that it is a self-assessment. So that to a certain extent, I mean, I'd argue maybe the more resilient organizations are the ones who are going to use the tool because they're already self-aware enough to know that this is an issue. And they're probably the ones who will use the tool more effectively, because there may be organizations out there who are deluding themselves about the enlightened business culture that they've got. But I mean, you have to start somewhere.
You have to start somewhere. Yes, you can. The old saying, you can take the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And this is the pond, which we hope people will sup from. At least those have an interest in it, but those who don't, you're probably not going to do anything to help. However, I would say that as the threats emanate from around the world, whether it's Ukraine or COVID, I think people are more conscious of how can I be more resilient. So I hope the awareness is there and the pond gets bigger.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. And I think, I mean, I feel, and this is, I guess, is a prejudice, but I think organizations as a whole over the last 15 years, we've seen apparently world-beating companies just disappear overnight when they weren't resilient, and that never happened in the last century. And so I think there's a much greater reality and a sense of reality that actually the nature of change and the nature of the 21st century means that today's heroes are tomorrow's acquisition targets.
Yes, and I think you illustrate the point of complexity here, that we are all so interconnected now, whether you like the word globalization or not. You can't dodge it. If you like the wings of the butterfly beating in the Amazonian forest, it causes ripples in so many different ways. And this is why I think a lot of companies suffer, that they have such complex supply chains that one part of it can go down and it upsets so much else. And hence, it's not a case of necessarily closing in the doors and being isolated and resilient yourself, because you can only work in a community. And that's what we've always been trying to advance, that businesses need to think beyond their 4 walls and treat resilience as a community engagement with the small corner shop, the dry cleaners, the business next door, because they're all going to suffer from a major incident. And if they don't work together, then they won't succeed. And there's a lovely picture of the Goldman Sachs building in the center of New York during one of the major floods that New York suffered. And the lights in the Goldman Sachs building are all blazing away, but around it is a complete sea of water. And the point is that Goldman Sachs may have been wonderfully prepared as it was to weather the storm and keep the lights on, but if you can't get people in or out, and you can't get food in or out, then you're not resilient, really. So it is a community engagement that you need to look at.
Clearly, the pandemic has been a really clear illustration of that. No, I think you're right. I mean, you may feel that you're incredibly resilient, but if all your suppliers basically
Yeah,
can no longer deliver, then it's not going to
yeah,
do you much good. So,
exactly.
so looking forward, imagine that you do the assessment, and where do you go from there? How can the process of assessing resilience help, you know, in the future? How can it help organizations?
Yes, well, our approach to this is that if we can get enough adoption of the tool we've created and assess that and validate it, we hope to be able to then use it as an accreditation mechanism, perhaps with an external body that would be able to um, more assure people that rather than self-assessment, that they were resilient, and give you some sort of certificate or blue badge, whatever, that you met certain standards. So that is a point about standards. I think this tool does help raise standards, and there are a lot of resilience orientated standards around. The British Standards Institute put out a lot of these sorts of things. But I think our tool gives some practical aid to raising those standards, because if you've done the tool and you like it, then you could apply to British standards and see if they could accredit you. I think it also tries to focus a point I made on community and place, because it makes you think about a wider concept, a wider world, supply chains, for example, that are important in future business. So I think this is a stepping stone to raising awareness of what resilience is about and how you can go about trying to make yourself more resilient, whatever the risks and whatever the nature of your business.